Hello, I'm Dina Mansour, Executive Director of the Maureen and Mike Mansfield Center. Thank you for joining us for The Long Game, China's Grand Strategy to Displace American Order. We are honored to feature Dr. Rush Doshi, Director of the China Strategy Initiative at the Council on Foreign Relations, in a conversation on China's global ambitions in technology, economy, and military development, and the implications for U.S. interest in foreign policy. The Mansfield Center was founded by an act of Congress in 1983 to foster globally minded leaders of integrity, with a focus on ethics and public affairs and international engagement. As our nation's longest-serving Senate Majority Leader, Mike Mansfield was known for his nonpartisan leadership of our country during turbulent times, with integrity, courage, and character. He studied and taught about the Far East here at the University of Montana and paved the way for Nixon's groundbreaking 1972 trip to China. Just 2 months later, Mansfield led a nonpartisan congressional delegation to China, and it is this history that inspires our dialogue series on China. I'm also honored to be one of just 2 members of the Council on Foreign Relations here in the state of Montana. The other is Joanna Shelton, who is the Vice Chair of the Mansfield Advisory Council. Founded in 1921, the Council on Foreign Relations is a nonpartisan organization that informs U.S. engagement with the world. We thank the Council for its investment in Montana and our audience through dialogues such as this one today. The conversation will be moderated by Owen Sirrs, a cultural and regional studies instructor here at the Mansfield Center, where he has taught U.S. military personnel deploying to the Far East, the Middle East, and Africa. We will weave previously submitted questions into the conversation, but Owen will also pose questions that are posted in the Q&A tab following Rush's initial remarks, so we encourage you to pose those questions throughout the conversation. Rush Doshi is the CV Star Senior Fellow for Asia Studies and Director of the China Strategy Initiative at the Council on Foreign Relations, as well as an Assistant Professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. He previously served as Deputy Senior Director for China and Taiwan at the National Security Council, where he helped draft U.S.-China strategy and coordinated policy efforts. Doshi is the author of The Long Game, China's Grand Strategy to Displace American Order, and has published widely in major media and academic journals. He holds a PhD from Harvard University, was a Fulbright Fellow in China, and has served as an officer in the U.S. Navy Reserve. Rush, thanks so much for joining us. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Dina. It's great to be with you, and thanks to all of you for joining this evening. I appreciate the chance to be in dialogue with each of you about Chinese strategy in the period ahead. I think what I'll start by talking about is whether China has a grand strategy. And so I think I'd like to use these initial remarks to talk about that broad question, what China's ambitions are, and maybe in Q&A people can ask questions more about policy, and we can get into the specifics of what to do. So to begin, yes, I think that grand strategy is an incredibly important concept, but it's also a concept that's not often well defined. We think about what it means. I think it's basically a state's theory, a country's theory of how it can achieve security. But what makes grand strategy grand, what makes it especially important, is that it's often coordinated across multiple means of statecraft, the military, the economic, the political. And if you think about it, that's quite rare. So when it happens, it's important because it allows a state to punch well above its weight. So the question in many ways then is, does China have a grand strategy? And if it did, where would that grand strategy live? And I think that the grand strategy of the Chinese government essentially lives in the Chinese Communist Party. And I think it's worth us starting with a little bit of history to better understand the party itself. The Chinese Communist Party was formed in the ferment of the Qing dynasty's decline. And there's 2 key things to know, I think, about the party up front. First, it's that because of that era of decline, because there was this sense that China was losing its position of greatness, there was a desire to rekindle China's previous position. And that meant that nationalism in many ways set the foundation for the Chinese Communist Party. That was the goal. And if nationalism was sort of the goal, then Leninism provided the means to achieve that goal. And essentially, Leninism is about having a vanguard of elite lead the masses in a highly centralized way to achieve some extremely ambitious goal. And generally speaking, Leninists are associated with communists. They generally want to see their country achieve communist, essentially revolution and utopia. But for China, the goal was less about that and more about rejuvenation, returning China to its previous state. So Leninist means to nationalist ends, and centralization at the heart of all of it. So if China has a grand strategy, it lives in the Chinese Communist Party. And the way to find it is to look at three things. First, you have to look for concepts of what that strategy is, and you can find them in texts, in documents. Then you got to see, do they have institutions, the capability to actually have a grand strategy? And you're really looking at national security institutions. And there are two things you have to ask yourself. Do they have the ability to coordinate multiple instruments, military, political, economic, all to advance this goal? And can they overcome what we would call parochial or vested interests who just aren't on the same page as national leadership? And then finally, you've got to see conduct or behavior that's largely consistent with that conceptual framework for strategy. So that is essentially what we mean when we say China has a grand strategy. We mean that it has something, a theory of how to achieve security, coordinated across multiple means, living within the Chinese Communist Party. So what is the strategy of China? Well, in the book, I basically write that there's multiple phases. But here's where we can start. Grand strategy is something that is rare. It's also very hard to turn around. Usually when you have a strategy, you stick with it, even if it's wrong, for two reasons. First, people are very slow to update their beliefs and their preferences and their approaches to the real world. So strategy tends to kind of stick. And second, organizations tend to be slow to adapt. They've got standard operating procedures, and a variety of other resource constraints. Once they're locked in on an approach, it's hard to change that approach as well. So it usually takes big shocks for strategy to change, something unexpected, whether that's Pearl Harbor, for example, or the collapse of American allies early during the Cold War. These kinds of sharp, discontinuous events are what set the template. And for China, there were a few different ones. In the 1980s, the US and China were basically quasi-allies working against the Soviet Union. It's a little remembered now, but back then, the US actually had signals intelligence facilities in Northwest China operating them with Chinese soldiers. I mean, American and Chinese official service members standing side by side operating a military base is not exactly what you think of today, but that's how things were. In the 80s, we gave China the best aircraft carriers, some aircraft carrier technology, missiles, helicopters, a bunch of other stuff, torpedoes. And so there was a really robust relationship. And the Chinese even thought that if the Soviets attacked China, that America might come to the rescue. But then things changed. There was a traumatic trifecta of events that caused China's perception of American threat to increase. Now, it already thought America was powerful, but now it thought America was threatening. And here were the three events. First, you had essentially the Tiananmen Square massacre in 1989. And for the Chinese government, they thought, wow, American ideology can actually collapse our entire Communist Party and our system of government. And if that happens, we'll never achieve rejuvenation. We can't allow it to happen. And that was the first concerning event for them. The second was 1990, the US Gulf War. And essentially the complete decimation of the Iraqi military, which in many ways was similar to the Chinese military, scared them. And finally, you had the collapse of the Soviet Union. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union, you had the loss of the shared glue that kept the US and China together. And all of a sudden, China thought America was threatening, but it also knew that it needed America to grow. And so it developed a strategy of hiding capabilities and biding time. Taguangyang Hui is what Deng Xiaoping, the Chinese leader at the time, called that strategy. And it was really about blunting American power, non-assertively, quietly. And I'll give you some examples. In the military dimension, it meant focusing on the kinds of capabilities that might allow you to keep the American military far away from your shores. Anti-access area denial capabilities is what we call them. They're asymmetric in that they're cheap, but can be used against more expensive platforms. And they're things that you would imagine, right? They're things like mines and missiles and submarines. That was the focus of the Chinese military in that period. That was just changed from the 1980s, where they were focused on the border with the Soviets. But then there's an economic component too. Remember, grand strategy has to have multiple instruments. So I've talked about the military. There's also the economic instrument. And what you see on the economic side is that China pursues what's called most favored nation status from the United States, or what we later called permanent normal trade relations. And what this essentially did was bind the hands of the United States, which previously had taken all kinds of trade action against China in the 1980s, even as we were quasi-allies. Now, we were going to find that much harder to do. And China wanted this to make it less likely to be subjected to American economic power. And then at the political level, there was a decision by China to look at America setting up all these institutions in Asia, and they were afraid this could be used against China. So again, to blunt American power, they joined those institutions, and they kind of sabotaged them from the inside, and that's the ASEAN Regional Forum and APEC. The point is, blunting really did occur across every instrument, and it was really a strategy that China had to employ from a position of weakness. But what happened when that weakness changed to strength? The next big shock was the global financial crisis in 2009. And essentially, China began to see the United States as weakening relative to China. They still thought America was stronger, but just not quite as strong. And if you think about it, China is probably the most important variable in their perception, in their strategic worldview, is their perception of American power. They've got phrases like the international balance of forces and multipolarity that are rough proxies for American power. And so essentially, with the global financial crisis, all those indicators, all those phrases changed in their authoritative documents. They said the international balance of forces is more balanced, multipolarity is inevitable. And because of that confidence, which you could see in their texts, they changed their strategy, which you can also see in their text. The Central Committee of the party itself came together and said, we're going to switch from Taoguang Yanghui, from hiding capabilities and biding time, to Jiji Yosuo Zuowei, which is to actively accomplish something. And that subtle shift in terminology that seems obscure to us was immensely important to them. And that decision was made by China's leader at the time, Hu Jintao, in a 2009 speech. Essentially, the ambassadorial conference is what it's called. They gathered the entire foreign policy establishment. And he told them, basically, we're making this change. On the military side, what you saw was a shift from the asymmetric approach to now an approach of projecting power to build order within region. You see, the shift from blunting to building was really about shifting from blunting American order to building Chinese-led order within Asia, and Asia essentially led by China. That requires investments. It requires a different strategic approach. So on the military side, again, you see a shift from just trying to keep America out to now put China in. They want China to be out in the region, in everybody's waters. They want to be able to project power. So they begin a carrier program. They make serial production of vessels. They invest in amphibious capabilities to take islands. They begin militarizing islands in the South China Sea, all because Hu Jintao told his staff that China needed to make more offensive moves. And this is about what that looks like. On the economic side, they went from trying to tie down America to now trying to project their own economic power. They wanted to use economic coercion, sanctions against neighbors. For the first time, they began doing this regularly. It's a policy change, and they launched what many of you have heard of, the Belt and Road Initiative, to basically create, through aid to Asian countries, this kind of relationship of dependence and positive goodwill that allows them to project their economic power in the region. It's a form of shaping the region to China's economic benefit. Then politically, they move from trying to sabotage American-led institutions to finally building their own institutions within Asia. So we go from blunting to building. But then a third change happens. You see, in 2015 and 2016, China begins to believe that maybe American democracy and European democracy is not so stable. They see Brexit, they see the election of a populist leader in the United States, in President Trump, but also the success of Bernie Sanders, and they think America is no longer governable. Now, they may be wrong, but that was the decision that they reached in their own internal assessments. America was essentially entering profound decline. And now is the time for China to take its order building strategy and apply it globally. And they have a phrase for this period, just like they have a phrase for the other periods. And the phrase is great changes unseen in a century. And this brings me back to what I began this brief lecture with, which is a reference to the collapse of the Qing dynasty that used to lead China and ushered in, when it collapsed, a century of humiliation. Now, back then, in the 1870s, one of the Qing's reformers, a guy named, well, it doesn't really matter. This particular reformer failed to reform China. And on his way out of power, he penned a line in his diary saying that the world was experiencing great change, or China was experiencing great changes unseen in 3,000 years. The idea was that for 3,000 years, China had been ascendant at the top, and now all of a sudden it was suffering European predation. And so his line was a sign of weakness. Great changes unseen in 3,000 years. And Xi Jinping took that line and he turned it into a sign of strength. Great changes unseen in a century. And if the old line evoked decline and weakness and humiliation, the new line evokes ascendance and strength and rejuvenation. And with it came a global grand strategy. Militarily, China was pursuing military bases, not just in its home region, but around the world, in Argentina, in the Mediterranean, in the Middle East, on the southeast coast of Africa, in Cambodia, in the Pacific Islands, all around the world to project power globally to become a global military. Economically, it no longer wanted to simply use economic power against its neighbors. It wanted to dominate global supply chains. It wanted to make the world more dependent on China and China less dependent on the world. And President Xi Jinping of China has a phrase for that called dual circulation. Now, when I worked at the White House, this dual circulation idea in China was just getting going. And I remember a very important meeting with a fellow ally in Asia that was very worried about dual circulation. And they came to us and they said, "Did you read President Xi's speech in 2021 about this, published in the Chinese Communist Party's magazine, Shi?" And we said, "In fact, we have, and we take it very seriously. And not only do we take it seriously, our allies take it seriously." Then there's technology. China doesn't just want to be a peer of the world on technology. It wants to sort of win the fourth industrial revolution. It believes there have been four revolutions. The first was steam power, which led Great Britain to become an industrial power and a geopolitical hegemon. Then there was electric, the second industrial revolution, electricity. Thomas Edison. The third was mass manufacturing, Henry Ford. And the United States led both of those industrial revolutions, and it rode them to its own global superpower status. Now, China believes there's a fourth industrial revolution, and it wants to lead that revolution, not just to prosperity, but to power. And the goal very much, and we can talk about what this looks like, is to win that revolution. And finally, on the political side, the global ambition is to reset the baseline. For a long time, the baseline of the international system has been democracy is good and liberal values are good. And many of the countries are democracies in the world. But China wants the baseline to be reset, to be more favorable to their system of government. And also they want to build their own edifice, their own blocks to be able to reshape global affairs. And you see that with China's association today with Russia, Iran, and North Korea. So let me end with this. What are the stakes of the competition today? And I think this is a good segue into the question and answer period. The stakes fundamentally for the United States, and I don't mean to be hyperbolic. In 2021, the Biden administration came together. We looked at the trend lines, we talked to the intelligence community, and we came up with the following conclusion in our classified China strategy, but this part is unclassified. That essentially, and by the way, that was like a 30-page strategy, 7 pages were dedicated to assessment. And the assessment was essentially that America risked becoming dependent on China's supply chains economically, falling behind a China that was spending more and more in science, in patents, in research innovation, falling behind that kind of China technologically. And finally, an America that would be defeated or could be defeated by China militarily in the Taiwan Strait. And the question for the United States is when we face a competitor with a grand strategy of its own, one that allows it to punch above its weight because it's coordinating all of its instruments for a particular goal. The question for us is, can America have its own grand strategy? Can America have an approach that is coordinated? Can we come together as a country to invest in ourselves, align with our allies, find a better way to compete across the economic, technology, military, and political domains at a time when, in many ways, this decade may be the decisive decade in the competition with China, that if we don't get this decade right, the trend lines might get away from us, and America could fall behind, irreversibly fall behind. So that's kind of what I think the stakes of the competition are. Not everybody agrees, and I'm happy to talk more about why I think that's the case. But I only wanted to speak for about 15 minutes so we could save the balance of the time for question and answer, and I will stop there to turn it over now for our moderated discussion. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Doshi, for those wonderful remarks. Very, very interesting, and obviously raising all the issues that I think should be front and center in our national dialogue. I think the first question I'm going to ask you is a direct lead into where you ended. Do you think right now that we have a grand strategy in this country?
Well, grand strategy is one of those things, Owen, that's extremely rare. I mean, if you think about what it requires two fundamental forms of coordination. Well, first, it requires a concept, a set of ideas, a strategy itself, if you will, in your head. Then it has to be implemented, which requires institutions, again, that can coordinate. So it's not easy for our system to coordinate multiple instruments, the military, the political, the economic. Back in the 1950s, Henry Kissinger gave this big TV interview where he talked about how difficult it was to coordinate all those instruments. And that was during the Cold War, when arguably we were more focused on such coordination. But there's a second thing you have to have those institutions do. And that's overcome parochial interests, right? We know sometimes that there are interests in society that are against reform. Take the example of shipbuilding. There are real challenges in building ships in America. And part of the reason why is because we have a system that rewards a few, very small number of companies, but ultimately protects them from some competition and from essentially adopting the best practices done around the world. And they don't have as much incentive to reform. And the result is we don't build enough ships well. We can't build ships nearly as well as even the Europeans, now, let alone the Chinese, Japanese, and Korean. So that's a vested interest. Can you circumvent that vested interest to find a way to be able to rebuild shipbuilding? That's the second capability. So it's coordination and it's overcoming parochial interest. And that's where our system falters a bit. I think we can all come together and have in our heads a concept of what a strategy should look like. That's the easy part. The hard part in international policy is translating your idea into practice. And quite frankly, I think America does not have a grand strategy when it comes to dealing with China. We have pieces, I'm remembered of what President Trump had said when he was asked about healthcare. He has concepts of a plan on health insurance. This is what he said in a debate. And I think we, as Americans, to use President Trump's words, which I think were more poetic than he intended, we also have concepts of a strategy, but we don't have the full strategy. And if you look at Democrats and Republicans, they each have a piece of the strategy that's right, but they don't have the whole piece. They've got to put it together. And the only place that can happen, Owen, is Congress. So let me end with this. If there's ever going to be an American grand strategy like there was during the Cold War, it doesn't come from the White House, in my opinion. This is a controversial view, because the conventional wisdom in political science and strategic studies is strategy lives with the executive. But my belief is in a democracy. We don't have a communist party. Remember, they have one. That's where strategy lives for them. It lives in the Communist Party. 90 million people strong. It coordinates across every instrument of statecraft, penetrates every level of government, penetrates every social institution. And we have nothing like it, thank God. We have nothing like it. So for us, what do we have? We have Congress. For Americans, grand strategy has to live in our democratic representative institutions, and there is no institution more representative than Congress. So that's where grand strategy has to come from. And that means fundamentally, grand strategy is about the voters. It's what they vote for. And so if we don't have it, it's because we essentially don't want it. It's not entirely an elite project. It's largely an elite project, but it's authorized by the American people, and it's authorized through Congress.
No, thank you very much for that. And that's kind of a segue into my next question, which is you kick off a chapter in your book with a quote from Deng Xiaoping to China's Politburo. The Soviets can do something after just one Politburo meeting. Can the Americans do that? And, that struck me. It struck me on a couple of levels. I mean, one is obviously in a one-party system, you want something to happen. And I mean, assuming the bureaucracy is going to play with you, it happens. The question that I have for you, though, is, and it raises the issue of accountability. I mean, where is the accountability in a system like that? And how could it negatively affect their perceptions of us? In other words, could they go down the road of assuming we're a lot weaker than we really are, and this could lead us both into a war that neither of us wants?
Well, Owen, it's a great question. I mean, how authoritarian governments are able to conduct foreign policy, how their perceptions evolve over time is a fundamental question. Authoritarian governments can move quickly in any direction. They can just as easily move forward in the wrong direction as the right direction. And that's why political theorists going back since antiquity have talked about how monarchy enlightened is good, but not enlightened, it can become tyrannical and disastrous. And China has had its flirtations, not even flirtations, it's full-on romances with disaster, right? We've had horrible, dark periods in Chinese history, right. The Great Leap Forward, the Cultural Revolution. You could even argue the one China policy the one child policy was its own form of disaster now. And there's many other examples. And so, I'm not sure most people given the choice are totally comfortable with a government that is fundamentally accountable only to itself and not the people. But at the same time, the Communist Party recognizes that challenge, and it's an adaptable institution. And you have to understand, we have to understand that they're not like complete idiots. I mean, you have idiots run autocracies around the world, and they go down into the ash heap of history. The Chinese Communist Party has 90 million members. it is essentially focused like a laser on two things, maintaining power, but also rejuvenating China. And there may be disagreements within the party on how to do that, but by and large, the party has a sense of cohesion about its goals that I think is unique among the elite of a country of that size. And that has allowed China to be more effective in prosecuting its goals across these areas. It's also why the party itself can coordinate because, quite frankly, there's a system of like 2,000 red classified phones across China, which connect every academic institution to the military, to the Politburo. I mean, basically everybody who's anybody in China is, if they're a party member, and they have to be, is given one of these red phones. And it's basically a network that steers the country. It's an incredible, it's a metaphor as much as it is an actual capability. It's a metaphor for coordination. So they can coordinate and go in the right place. They can coordinate and go in the wrong place. This also has implications for getting assessments wrong, right? So the question you're asking, Owen, is really, does Xi Jinping get good information, or are people who are afraid of getting fired or purged or killed going to tell him what he wants to hear? And, look, you work in any system, you have any boss, sometimes there's an incentive to not be the bearer of bad news. And in a system like theirs, there's a strong incentive. But they're also trying to build checks on those challenges. I think President Xi probably has multiple sources of information. I think it's not a perfectly good information environment, but he has some. And the risk really is, like you said, that he could see America maybe weaker or maybe stronger. His perceptions go in a lot of directions that could lead to conflict. He could, for example, see our actions as more provocative than they are. And what you want to do, what I learned from the privilege of service I had in government, was what you want to do is help dispel misperceptions about what you're doing. You want to clear up miscommunication. You want to shape those information channels so he gets the right information. I'm not saying you're deceptive. It's not going to work to be deceptive. I'm saying you're quite frankly contextualizing what you're doing. If you put export controls on Chinese chips to China, you might say, okay, well, the Chinese are freaking out about this. You could say to them, listen, we're only putting chips on this percentage, export controls on this percentage of your chips. We're also going to allow you to do X, Y, and Z. This isn't a full-blown effort to cripple your economy. Look, here are all the reasons why. And they might not believe you, but you have to try. And if it works even 40% of the time, that can be the difference between escalation and de-escalation and war and peace. So yeah, autocracy, you cannot think about policy without asking how your opponent or your adversary or your competitor is going to think. And you can't get that right unless you consider their system of government. That's the basis of strategic empathy. And that's a skill, all policymakers, quite frankly, need to develop to be more effective in their roles. And that's why it's helpful when you deal with a country to have background in that country.
Absolutely. And where you need the expertise on that country.
And I'm sure this is something you tell folks before they go overseas, that expertise, that strategic empathy is the key to being effective in your role.
Absolutely. And this is kind of also a tee off to my question. I mean, I noticed in the early chapters of your book, you mentioned, I wouldn't say you downplay the role that Xi Jinping plays in all this, but you make the clear statement that this is something that the party as a whole is managing the process, which seems to fly in the face of what I would call conventional wisdom, maybe in the U.S. I was wondering if you could just elaborate. We seem to be enamored in this country with great men or great women, right, directing the affairs of state, and the whims of their personality are going to affect things.
It is a contrarian view that I have had. I first articulated it 8 years ago, and a lot has changed in 8 years. So I think the view largely holds up, but the longer that Xi Jinping is in power, the more it's going to reflect some of his personality more than the party. But even when it reflects his personality, my argument would be it reflects the party's ultimate interests and preferences. That Xi might have, let's say, he might have his own view of how to achieve those goals, but the goals, the North Star, the course was laid in by the party itself. And that course was laid in before the party even existed. I mean, go back. The party was founded about 100 years ago. Before it was founded, China had already experienced, by that time, almost 70 years of humiliation, really close to a century already of humiliation. Having lost the Opium Wars to the UK in the 1830s, having been colonized by Japan and Germany, it was disaster after disaster befalling what was once the most wealthy and powerful empire on earth at that time. And all of these guys who were young, leaders in what was then the Nationalist Party that unified China, and then the Communist Party that ultimately defeated the Nationalist Party and took over. All of these guys were nationalists at heart. Mao Zedong, when he was young, put posters on his walls, and the posters weren't of pop stars. I mean, they weren't really pop stars back then in China. There were posters of nationalist intellectuals, which proves something that people don't realize about Mao, that for all his peasant, fixation on like charming the peasants and surrounding the cities by getting the peasants on board, he was kind of a nerd because he was really focused on a lot of random Chinese intellectual writers. And he would joke that they should be the ones leading China. Not even joke, he'd be quite serious about them being the ones to lead China. But think about that. Think about a teenager putting nationalist writers on his wall. That's how he found communism. His successor, Deng Xiaoping, the other great man of China, who built the modern China we see today through reform and opening, he, at the age of 14, went to France. And when asked why he went to France, he said, I went to France to learn because China was weak, and I wanted to make it strong because China was poor, and I wanted to make it rich. And his father was a member of a prominent nationalist political party founded by one of the very same people who was on the poster, was on a poster in the bedroom of Mao. So you see these connections, this intellectual ferment, these ideas cross-cutting a vast country and its elite. And you see it all come down to these two institutions, the Nationalist Party and the Communist Party, which both are actually Leninist political parties, very focused on centralization, amoral, willing to commit atrocities to accomplish their political aims. They're revolutionaries. They romanticize revolution. Mao romanticizes revolution. If you'd like, we can talk about Mao's father and how much he romanticized revolution. But that's who these guys are. And so then you ask the question, does this exercise a long shadow over to their policy today? Well, do the founding fathers of the United States exercise a long shadow over American discourse? I seem to remember 15 years ago, members of the Tea Party dressing up like the founding fathers. I seem to remember today, we're always trying to interpret their will as we read our own Constitution. There is something in the political DNA of our country that goes back to our founding, and it's true in China as well. It's just that their founding fathers are different. They have different views. They're not motivated by liberty and the pursuit of happiness. They're motivated by grievance and the pursuit of rejuvenation and nationalism, not patriotism defined liberally, but conservatively. And so ultimately, that's who we're dealing with. And so when Xi Jinping says, I want rejuvenation, yeah, he wants it. Not only has he said it, every Chinese leader has said it of the Chinese Communist Party going back to the founding. When he says, I want China to be number one, he doesn't quite say it like that. But when I claim, and it's my argument, that he wants to displace America, I argue that that's a belief that extends back to the very earliest nationalist, who was not even a communist. It was Sun Yat-sen, who united China, who lived in America for a lot part of his life. And what was his singular goal? That China would overtake the West. And when Lee Kuan Yew, the former prime minister of Singapore, was asked, what does China want? Does it want to be number one? And this he was asked in the early 2000s. He said, yes, of course. Why wouldn't they want to be number one? And it's not that crazy. Post-colonial countries often want to be able to surpass the people that colonized them, and China is no different. So Xi Jinping is basically carrying a project, a baton, as he himself puts it, the baton of history has been passed from leader to leader. It's in his hands. He has his own style, his own views, but nonetheless a common set of goals. And if you look at the way that Chinese strategy has changed, I'll end with this. It's always changed when the Central Committee studies the international balance of forces and says, here's how it's changed. They think about it. They study it. They study it through all these meetings. And then they write about it. And then they say, okay, here's how this affects strategy. The party is the place where strategic adjustment occurs. And it always has been. And I think even today, it still is. And no matter who is in charge, you would see that commonality of purpose across China.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you point out in your book that the art of understanding communist parties was kind of lost with the end of the Cold War and the demise of the Soviet Union. It was almost like an entire establishment of American intellectuals who had specialized in Communist Party dynamics said, guess my job's done, time to go. And in fact, Leninist parties continued in a number of countries, and of course, China's the preeminent example.
That's exactly right. We used to have this organization, and actually, Owen, you probably used its services, right? The Foreign Broadcast Information Service, which was founded in 1941, its predecessor, by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the great American institution builder across the board, including national security. He created this institution. It lasted through the Cold War. It would mass acquire and translate foreign material, including material of particularly the Soviet Union, the Chinese Communist Party. And it would make it available not just to government officials, but to academics around the country. So they could all be a part of the shared national analytic exercise that was understanding our competitors and our adversaries, the kind of stuff that happens or should happen at universities. And today we don't do that. FIBIS was shut down in the Obama administration in 2013 over copyright questions. I mean, come on, really.
Seriously,
And then
yeah.
after that, what was left of it was no longer made available to anybody. And so, we lost a capability, a force multiplier, which was to give our academics access to the key material so that they can figure out the conclusions on their own. And when I wrote my book, Owen, The Long Game, I decided to, basically use the methods of those Cold War Kremlinologists and Pekingologists to basically understand contemporary China, a job that, quite frankly, I shouldn't have had to do or that nobody should have had to do, because if we had made the materials available, it'd be more evident to everybody. And reading your competitor is a key part of what I would call strategic empathy.
Oh, absolutely. So I'm going to read one of the questions that's come up. So how do you think internal pressures such as economic slowdowns or demographic shifts might change China's grand strategy in coming decades?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think the audience member who asked it, I mean, there's a lot of discussion about how China is weakening. China's demographics are bad. It's one of the fastest aging societies on the planet. Its population by the end of the century will fall by about half. Economically,
Wow.
After they got rid of their zero COVID policy, there was stagnation. They haven't really been able to kick up growth. But I have a contrarian view here as well. I think China has very real weaknesses: high debt, aging population, as I said, stagnation on growth, as I said, a reliance on exports to basically prop up its economy. And yet it also has undeniable strengths. And I think Americans have to look at these judiciously. They have to look at the strengths and the weaknesses. They have to look at things on net relative to the United States as well and our allies and partners. Let me give you a few other statistics, Owen. In manufacturing, China is 30% of all global manufacturing. America is 15%. 25 years ago, America was 30%. China was maybe 3 to 6%. Call it 6 for now. Let's be generous. They quintupled their share of global manufacturing in 25 years. Ours went down by half. And the UN estimates that in 2030, in just 5 years, China will achieve close to 40 to 45%, and we will be down to about 11% of global manufacturing. Now, this is a little concerning to me because manufacturing matters. It's the foundation for innovation. It's the foundation for defense. It's the foundation for, not just innovation in science, but innovation in market application. It is critical to the rise and fall of great powers. And when America was rising, in World War I, we were 30% of the world's manufacturing. After World War II, we were 50%. Our victories were built on that scale that we had. If you ask the leaders of the Axis powers in World War II what they feared about America, it wasn't that we had better planes. We didn't. It wasn't that we had better ships. We didn't. It wasn't that we had better tactics. We didn't. It was that we had better, vastly better productive capacity. And Hitler wrote about how he was afraid of America being a state of unimaginable productive capacity. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Japan's offensives in Asia, said, if I have to go to war with America, I can run wild for the first year, but I have no guarantee after that, because essentially their productive capacity was too great. The Italian foreign minister at the time said that a war with America would be a contest of stamina, and essentially America would have the stamina. And today, as China in the next 5 years is going to build 65 new surface combatants, taking its navy to 435, whereas America will actually decrease a little bit to about 300. They will have a navy that's almost 50% larger. They have a lot of other advantages too with manufacturing that allow them to stay in the fight if there is a conflict. And so in many ways, I fear there's an inversion of what happened in the last century. In the last century, we were the big kids on the block. Now it might be China in manufacturing. Now, that doesn't mean they don't have a lot of weaknesses, but they can do a lot with manufacturing. And they're also being able to convert manufacturing to advantage in science and technology. Right now, they lead. You can quibble with the statistics, and you can say they're nonsense patents, but they lead the world in active patents. They lead the world in top-cited scientific publications. Even if you control for some of that and say it's nonsense, it's still very impressive. and they spend more on basic science than we do. And right now, I think the United States has actually opted under the current administration to make some cuts. Maybe they'll be reversed. It's not clear they're going to stick, but a lot of those cuts are leading to really significant setbacks in scientific research. Researchers are canceling projects because they don't have guaranteed funding. And so it's going to slow us down. Meanwhile, Xi Jinping yesterday gave a massive speech about the need for China to dominate science and technology in the future. So, if you think the battleground of the competition is manufacturing and technology, China is the world's leading producer in a lot of high tech sectors. They make, of all the electric vehicles in the world, they make more than 70%. They make all the batteries. They are 90% of commercial drones, UAVs that you could be using like in the battlefield in Ukraine. They are 90% plus of certain critical minerals that you use from everything from your phone to your wind turbine to your circuits. They also are producing 90+% of our fermented, what's called APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, which are basically antibiotics, fermented APIs. So we're dependent on China for our antibiotics, but on so much more. Now, here's the thing. I don't want to end with pessimism, and I've gone on for a little while, but I want to make sure I take some extra time to end with something positive on this question. America, together with its allies and partners, completely swamps China. It's not even a contest. One-on-one, they got the better of us now. They're big, right? They're 1.4 billion people. On a few areas, they're the heavyweight. We just have to be realistic about stuff like that. But you put us together with Canada, Mexico, the European Union, including France, Germany, and the UK and Italy. You add in Japan and Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, and the heavyweight champ of all of them, India. And we really have scale on the Chinese. We will then be 60% of global GDP to their 25%. We'll be 60% of global manufacturing to their 35%. We'll be 2 to 3 times more on patents, 2 to 3 times more on top-sided scientific publications, 3 times more to 4 times more on defense spending. Even 2 times probably is a more accurate number, but still 2 times more on defense spending. We take them on every metric as long as we hang together. And Ben Franklin had this apocryphal quote. It was that if we don't hang together, we'll all hang separately. And I think that is the question for the world today. If America and its allies and partners that are part of the American sort of liberal order or imperium, if you'd like, or empire, liberal empire, whatever you want to call it, but we have it, it exists. If all that sticks together, we can take them. But if it breaks, they can take us.
Right. And actually, that's a great segue into my next question. This romantic idea that we have in this country about India, it seems like we have been wooing India for decades, right? And it seems like the wooing is more on our part than theirs. They're sitting back and saying, yeah, you can come to us and we'll see what you have to offer. And we might consider it. But I mean, I was wondering if you would be willing just to comment a little bit on India's share in all this. And
yeah, India historically was very close to the Soviet Union, distrusted America, was run by a political party, the Congress Party, which for a large portion of its time was a bit more skeptical of America, while gradually the Nationalist Party, the current party in charge, the BJP, became more pro-American. By the way, they didn't start out pro-American, they just ended up that way. I think India today is probably more pro-American than it's ever been. Now, they're still also very pro-Russian, so that's complicated, but they're super anti-Chinese. And so in 2020, there was a military clash between China and India, and 24 Indian soldiers were killed in this military clash, and they were killed brutally. Manual attacks, not bullets. I mean, beaten to death by clubs with nails and stuff. Horrible things. And the Indians found the Chinese basically trying to seize their territory on the border, not to mention backing a nuclear-armed Pakistan, and they were just fed up with all this, and they had no other place to go. The Russians aren't going to help them. The Russians are basically subsidiaries of China now. And the Japanese are too small, and the Australians are too irrelevant. And so you only have, relative to Russia for arming the Indians. So the only party left is America. And America is now, the relationship with India is bipartisan and strong. The relationship really took off under Bill Clinton. It got much better under George W. Bush. Barack Obama took it to newer heights after a rockier start. And then really Donald Trump did a very good job on India in his first term, really was able to connect to Indian Americans and also in India to the Indian citizen, to the average Indian, more importantly. And also had a good relationship with Prime Minister Modi. President Biden was also quite successful with Indians. Even more happened with India defense cooperation, science and technology cooperation. Now the second Trump term is happening, and India's basically in great shape relative to other countries with America. President Trump has really invested in this relationship. The first phone call, one of the first phone calls that the new Deputy Secretary of State made was to the Indians. This relationship really has potential. Now, you're right, Owen. India is self-interested. They like where they are. Everybody wants to court them. Everybody wants to be friends with India right now. And they have a little bit of leverage. They can go to China and say, hey, can you do something for us? And we have to realize that there's going to be that dynamic because India is in high demand. But also, India is the only country in the West to have moved very decisively against Chinese technology companies like TikTok, to ban certain Chinese investment. It's actually been more forward-leaning in some areas than the US. And as they always tell Americans, we're dealing with these guys every day on the border. You guys just deal with them in the air and the water. Now, I think that's unfair, and I don't agree with the Indians when they say that. I think they're wrong. But that being said, it's true. They have skin in the game. And I think that relationship is really one in which will determine whether America, in this larger order, endures or whether China is able to run the table. India is the only other country with scale.
Yeah, I have to agree absolutely with that. So one question that came in is, what role do you see emerging technologies such as artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, and quantum computing playing in this next phase of our competition with China?
Yeah, and here we can just quote the Chinese. They think that this technology is the bedrock of the fourth industrial revolution. And I think if they win this technology, they win that revolution, and then they win just not prosperity, but also geopolitical dominance. So, I mean, we can go through each of those, right? Let's take artificial intelligence. We're all seeing what LLMs can do every day. It's unbelievable. It's a little frightening, but that's nothing. Imagine when those LLMs are embodied. Not the LLMs, but the artificial intelligence is embodied, right? We call it embodied AI. You have a humanoid robotic superstructure and you put this software in it. And the data that trains the robot essentially is the data from us. We're human beings, right? We can basically attach sensors to ourselves, and robots can, I'm saying robots, but really it's algorithms can learn, how to operate based on the data we're sort of feeding them. That's why humanoid robotics is interesting, because it's the path to being able to really have artificial intelligence be embodied in the real world and operate physically with the real world. Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters because you could have essentially a singularity appear on the factory floor. Remember, singularity is the crazy sci-fi term for the melding of human consciousness with artificial intelligence. You could have a version of that essentially on the factory floor. And if you look at China today, I mean, people talk about aging, but actually China's going all in on removing labor from the equation. They're investing heavily in capital equipment. Of all the industrial robots installed around the world, more than half were installed last year in China. And if you look at the plants building Chinese cars, they don't have very many people working in them. China is not competing against America on low labor cost. They're not out competing America on slave labor, although they certainly have that. They're outcompeting us because they're investing in technology and they're applying it at scale faster than we are, and because they've got great infrastructure, and because they're manipulating their currency, because their currency is undervalued. Those are their advantages, and they have massive industrial policy and subsidies. But it's not the labor arbitrage anymore. That's old. It's this other stuff, right? Stuff that countries do, states do. China has a government that is taking steps to dominate the future. So artificial intelligence is key. Quantum communications and cryptography is important as well, because quantum can break end-to-end encryption. It revolutionizes communications. It changes everything in the cyber domain. And cyber itself is very important. As many on this call may know, the Chinese government is now a matter of public record, has compromised American critical infrastructure in gas, power, water, telecom, and transportation. What we mean by that is that they put web shells or accesses on all of that stuff, so they can basically push a button if they want, turn it off. And that would affect the lives of tens of millions of Americans. So cyber is sort of the invisible weapon. AI is the future of everything. And quantum is the biggest disruption to the way in which we communicate, or computers even operate, since the dawn of the modern semiconductor and since the dawn of electrical engineering.
It's frightening stuff.
Yeah, well, actually, real quick, America has the lead in AI right now with LLMs, but it's not a stable lead. That's why the Biden administration, when we were there, put export controls in part on China to make sure that we wouldn't give them our best chips, so they couldn't come up with the best AI. We wanted to lead in AI, and we didn't want them to apply that stuff for military purposes. Now, in the end, they did find ways to innovate, but in the future, this kind of AI we're talking about is going to require enormous amounts of what we call compute, which is basically running chips. And that's something that they're going to find harder and harder to do. So America has been in quantum, we're ahead on in general, although we're behind in quantum communications. And on cyber, we have certain advantages. They have certain advantages. It's complicated, but people shouldn't despair. What I think the key here is that, if, frankly, my belief is America has everything it needs to win this competition. The only thing it needs is a strategy and people behind it.
Amen to that. So one question that came in is, what do you consider to be the most significant misperception in the U.S. about China and its
Hmm.
long-term intentions?
I think there are two. I think the U.S. historically, our direction of bias on China, right? You can have a bias, and statistics
Yeah,
go in two different ways, right? Our direction of bias has historically been to underestimate their capability. So 30 years ago, China will never try to dominate Asia. It'll never be able to do it. Well, it's trying. It'll never build an aircraft carrier. Well, it did. It'll
yeah,
never have an overseas base. Well, it does. It'll never innovate in technology. Well, it happened. It'll never lead in the commercialization of innovative technology. That's happening too. It'll never exceed us in basic science research. Well, you're right. They haven't gotten there yet, but they're spending more on science and technology than we are, and they do exceed us in patents and in top-sided publications. So our direction of bias has always been, well, we're amazing. We're America. Look at us. And I think even 5 years ago, people didn't realize that you can have a big GDP. That could also mean you're spending a lot of money wastefully on healthcare or in financial services. It doesn't mean a big GDP is big production.
right.
Gross domestic product. It has product in there. The product doesn't have to be actual production. I'm always reminded that Russia is 1/10 to 1/15 the size economically of Europe. France alone is bigger, but France's biggest companies are like Louis Vuitton, right? They're like fashion companies. And that adds to GDP, it adds to market capitalization, and it makes France look tough. But the reality is, you cannot go to war with Louis Vuitton. You cannot dominate technology with Louis Vuitton. You can't do anything with that other than make money. And so the West has optimized itself for wealth, for extracting returns from capital. If you have to be a business, it's better to be in the service and high tech business and finance business than it is to be in low margin manufacturing. But low margin manufacturing is the stuff on which power is built. It's not fun to take on tasks that might be like, let's say, being a plumber or an electrician relative to being, a race car driver or a banker. But the reality is those jobs, those blue collar jobs, are underpinning everything in the American economy. There's a material foundation, and that's true in manufacturing. And when you neglect the material foundations, everything else rots. So that's kind of how I would approach that broad perspective.
One thing that struck me, uh, there used to be a journalist for The Economist who wrote under the label of Chagwan.
Yeah,
And
remember. Yeah.
yeah, and he recently left, and the newspaper's really lacking his expertise. But one of the things that he mentioned just before he left China was in terms of something to offer the rest of the world, right? I mean, this is very broad. We're getting away strictly from power, maybe moving to soft power. But I mean, he mentioned, there was a time when China, in its neck of the woods, of course, offered its character system, elements of its high culture, which you find in all the neighboring countries. I mean, there were things that China contributed, and he was remarking that in the China of today, what is the equivalent in terms of soft power that China could offer? And I was wondering, I mean, maybe that's just too broad a comment, but I was wondering if you could comment on China's soft power and what and how that can affect its position as well.
China does lack the kind of cultural soft power that the United States has. It's not even really close. Korea has more cultural soft power than
Yeah,
China. Japan has more cultural soft power than China, and probably most embarrassingly, Taiwan probably has more cultural soft power than all of China. But they have another kind of power. You
mm,
could call it soft power. It's not really soft power, but maybe it's a little bit of soft power. And that's that China has been associated since the 1980s with the idea of China has been associated with the idea of prosperity. That when you think China, you think gleaming
yeah,
cities and skyscrapers and pragmatism and prosperity. You think about Deng Xiaoping's China, which is the
yeah,
China that opened itself up pragmatically to the world and even, um, you know, basically ushered in 14% annual growth for, many, many years. Um, so they live off that, right? That many people think in the developing world that China is synonymous with development, that China is the way in
Mm.
which you develop. And there's a lot of admiration for what China has accomplished. But at the same time, in the West, there's also a lot of negative, not soft power, but maybe soft antagonism or
Mm.
soft anxiety. I'm not sure what the word is actually, but basically, there's a lot of soft impressions of China that are negative. And what they are oriented around is the human rights problems, the repression, the youth unemployment, this idea that essentially the system is crushing the human spirit. And this idea is also very powerful too. And I'm remembering when the Europeans were signing an investment agreement with China, which was very bad for the United States. The reason it didn't end up happening was because the Biden administration put sanctions with Europeans on those in China involved in the Uyghur genocide.
Right.
And essentially, what happened in response is China targeted parliamentarians in Europe. And Europeans, sort of forced to confront the question of values directly, opted to kill that investment agreement. And so,
Mm.
China's got its strength and its weaknesses flow from the same wells. Like it's got this perception of being the
Mm.
future and the vanguard and all that. And that may not even be true anymore. I mean, their economy really is stagnating. But at the same time, they've also got this sort of negative perception about their autocratic form of government, Tiananmen Square, the one child, all that stuff. In general, I guess I'd end with this. I mean, it really is true that China is stagnating, like I said, but it's possible for two things to be true. It's possible that China could be weakening. It could have bad macroeconomic indicators. It could have macroeconomic problems, but it could also be formidable strategically, right? Two things can be true. You can have economic
Right.
challenges and strategic benefits, and they're not the
Right.
same. Japan was weaker than the United States. Pearl Harbor they were still doing pretty well in
Wow.
the early part of the war. Germany was tiny Nazi Germany compared to its neighbors. It did a pretty good job, compared to its neighbors collectively, at being able to repel the militaries of France and Russia and Great Britain and even the United States for a period. So remember that ultimately power is not the same as prosperity.
Yeah. And that's something you make very clear in your book, that it's, prosperity and power go together. And it's been a consistent theme among Chinese intellectuals going back to the century of shame.
Right. And
Um,
now, actually, I guess what I'm saying is a little unusual. I'm saying that it's possible that China could,
mm.
on the macroeconomic side, stagnate, but
Mhm.
continue to be formidable strategically
Yeah.
and technologically. That they could end up having inflation, or sorry, low growth,
Right.
but massive technological innovation and manufacturing buildup.
Yeah. Well, I think that's where we're going to have to leave it, Dr. Doshi. And thank you very, very much for your time, for staying up late on your end of the country so that we can attend your lecture on this end of the country. And again, greetings from Montana, and thank you very much for your time and attention.
Well, thank you, Owen. Thank you, Dana,
Mhm.
and thank you all for joining me tonight. Hopefully, you found this useful and worthwhile. Have a great evening.
Absolutely.